Hello and welcome to Shpielberg. I'm your host, Nathan.
And I'm John.
We're your co-hosts, and we're here to talk about films, video games, stories, theology, and everything in between. In other words, we're here to give you the spiel. How you doing, John?
I'm doing great. I'm excited for today.
I am also very excited. Today is my day, and I think we talked about this a little bit on the tail end last episode. But today we are reviewing the one and only On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien.
So Nathan, you are our resident, what's the word? Person who looks things up.
Resident Looker-Upper. That is my title.
Resident Looker-Upper.
Mm-hmm. That's on my desk.
You had mentioned that you were going to look into kind of the history of what this mysterious essay is. You know, who wrote it? When did it come out? What was the context that it existed in?
Yes. So I did some research, and then I realized that literally the first paragraph of this essay gives a fairly good summation of the context. There's additional things like when it was published and what Christopher Tolkien, his son, did to make it like kind of an expanded edition with another compilated works that I think is the current one we have now that you can purchase, and that's still under copyright law. We are using a free version, at least as of now, that will hopefully be in the link below. Please check it out. It's pretty much everywhere. This is the only... John, what did you say about this link in particular?
So this one is made available on the Internet Archive.
Yes.
I tried to look for digital copies that were legal, that we could have our dear listeners read along with or read for themselves. And I could only find one that was posted in a public location that wasn't on a questionable website or was scraped from the depths of someone's website by web crawlers. In other words, this particular copy is in a very public location, and if the Tolkien family does not want this to be made public, they have the full capability of taking it down. I will be clear that we are not hosting this.
No, we are not.
And if this is a violation of copyright law, we can easily remove the link. But this essay is available on Amazon and other booksellers for a fairly reasonable price on paperback. If you want a hard copy, then good luck.
Yes, there is some commentary in addition to if you get the paperback. We are using, for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to use the public version of...
public linked.
Yeah, the public link of... On Fairy Stories. It is a brilliant essay, as hopefully you'll find out. Some context. So this is a lecture series that Tolkien gave in, as it says, in St. Andrews. And this was expanded to become an essay later on in life. The lectures themselves were delivered in 1938, as the first paragraph states, but also this whole essay was published approximately around 1947. And that's the version we have today. Again, the modern version has some commentary, some additional things that are compiled by Christopher Tolkien and the publishers. But it is a masterful essay. In addition, the context, as you'll see if you read through it, there is probably more quotations than, I don't know, most scientific journals. It is incredibly dense. Something to preface before we continue. Tolkien's second paragraph, it says, "And overbold I fear I may be accounted." And although I've read this before, we both have kind of, John, we were talking about this beforehand. We're kind of approaching this in the same manner, that we feel overbold to talk about this essay since it's so deep. But that's what we're going to go into, it broad strokes in this essay. And we're just going to try to draw out the wealth of information from the small tidbits that have been reflected in our reading. There's many quotations that you can go. Max Mueller, Andrew Lang is a big quotation that Tolkien uses. Chesterton, one of my favorite authors, is also a heavily used emphasis, and we'll go through that, see how much Tolkien really leans into Chesterton. But so those are the background details.
Yeah, this particular podcast episode is not supposed to be an exhaustive look at this essay. I'm fairly confident to say that we will be returning to this essay from time to time throughout the life of Shpielberg, just because of how, like you said, how deep, how dense it is. I felt like the longer I was reading it, the more I was sinking into it. And with each new layer of depth, I'm like, oh, I haven't fully explored the other layer. This is too much. Help, someone throw me a rope.
It is incredible. It's masterful. If you haven't read it, viewers, please do. So, On Fairy Stories. What is On Fairy Stories? What is it about? First of all, we have to understand this is an essay. I kind of went into it a little bit, but this is British-styled academic paper. I first read this, I don't know. John, when was the first time I talked to you about On Fairy Stories?
Maybe 2 years ago.
2? I feel like it's been so much longer.
I remember you bringing it up 2 years ago, but you may have even mentioned it, upwards of 5.
I like that, but it could be 5 or 2, which is amazing. So I remember very vividly the first time I read C.S. Lewis, and I was probably so far out of my depth that this was only like Mere Christianity, and I knew, so this is the concept that we'll probably keep coming back to. I knew this man, C.S. Lewis, in that case, was brilliant. I just didn't know exactly what he was saying. I kept reading the line and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But I couldn't reiterate what he was saying. I could glimpse the topic, but I couldn't understand what he said. And that's when I came to On Fairy Stories. So On Fairy Stories is literally just a beautifully written essay that Tolkien did. Remember, as reflected from his lectures at St. Andrews, this essay is exactly its title, On Fairy Stories. And he goes through his particular, and I would say very unique perspective on fairy stories. Now, I've read Honko's Toward a Definition of Mythology, folklore, which actually both of those things have to do similar to what Tolkien talks about. But Ben Amos's definitions of folklore, all those are very scholarly works. They're very good. They're insightful. But this adds a dimensionality to the experience of fairy stories that is completely unique. And it is primarily and chiefly explaining the mystery that fairy stories has behind the cold, rubriced story that we could define fairy stories as. When I first read it, I understood that this was amazing and this was revolutionary. And 2 years, ago, when I shared it with John, I still thought it was revolutionary, but I didn't get a full glimpse of it. And reading Chesterton, reading more C.S. Lewis, reading Tolkien, reading more of the British giants in thought has made it more and more clear.
So he starts off by kind of explaining what fairy stories are, roughly.
Very roughly.
And then as he continues, he finds that he has to ask,
what are the origins of fairy stories?
Yes. And then leading out of origins, he discusses the common association of fairy stories with children. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you, Nathan, as well as I, grew up hearing some of these fairy stories read to us when we were very tiny lads. So he argues whether or not that they should even be read to children. And if children are their primary target of fairy stories, what does that mean? And then from there, he goes in to discuss what fantasy even is, and what its purpose is within a fairy story, as well as the concepts of recovery, escape, and consolation, and who exactly these are for, why they're there, and what purpose they serve. And then after going through those things, he closes out his essay in one of the most just fantastic things that we will definitely go into in this episode.
For sure.
Towards the end.
So we're just going to jump into it. The same structure we use for movies is going to be used for this. Now, in the intro, I have mentioned before that we talk about films, video games, stories, theology, and everything in between. And in our logo, we have a little quill. And this is exactly the purposes of Shpielberg, is to really understand concepts, writers, essays, books, etc. And so this will be the first book we're going to review, and we're going to format it the same we do for films. So number one is our likes and dislikes. Now, this will be tailored, of course, to literature. And then we'll do author's intent, or John, what was the way you phrased it before we got on?
Yeah, instead of author's intent, the way I see it is it's more author's arguments. Because this is an essay, he brings up various concepts, various ideas, various arguments as to what he's trying to get across to the reader. And so in the same way that we approach movies, as what was the author's intent of producing this, I ask then, what is the author's arguments and what are his points that he brings up in this essay?
So the rationale, the language to back that rationale will be number three, author's intent. And then number four, very similar to last week's discussion, I have a feeling that this will not be too far off, if not pretty much dead on the Christian mindset. Although there is some discussion that I'd like to get in how this directly relates to Scripture. So anyway, let's get into it. John, what is your likes? And then we'll get into dislikes.
Oh, so this is difficult because I very thoroughly enjoyed reading this. And this was one of those things that wasn't too deep to understand, but was just deep enough to feel that I was treading water in waters I'm a bit unfamiliar with. I guess for context about me, I don't read too much, and I would say I appreciated the writing style that Tolkien had here. Again, not too deep, but just deep enough that I was a bit uncomfortable. And it was not quite to the point where I had to stop after every line, but every couple of lines, I had to really think about what he was saying and pause a bit and really take it in. It wasn't like most reading that I've done, where you can kind of turn your brain off or even skim it and just read, the opening and closing of each paragraph to get a general idea of what he was saying. You're going to miss out on a lot of nuance if you do that with this particular essay. And so personally, I appreciated the depth because it was one of those things that I haven't had to stop and chew on writing in quite some time. I appreciated his wit and his sarcasm at times. I appreciated his bluntness. I'm sure we'll get into it, but there's a few things that he talks about where he thoroughly disagrees with the way certain things are viewed in fairy stories. Normally, I'm used to hearing people just going along with the status quo. And for him to come up and say, no, I don't agree with that, and then let's go in and talk about it. I was like, oh, this is delightful. Actually bringing up arguments. It's great.
My likes, all of it in its totality.
That's cheating.
Viewers, I need to stress upon you the earth-shattering reality of this essay. It changed my perception fundamentally. So above my reading chair is the entirety of the epilogue, and it's a beautiful.
You have a reading chair?
I have a reading.
Is it like made out of leather next to like a fireplace? And you have like a deerskin rug that you hunted yourself? Like,
how did you guess that? Wow.
I'm envisioning almost like the library in Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
With this massive fireplace that you read next to. And on the wall next to you there is On Fairy Stories in all of its glory.
Yeah, it's about 7 feet tall.
Exactly.
Yes, I do. It's funny, actually. I mostly read at my desk now, so I don't know why I have the chair anymore. It's like just taking up space, whatever. It doesn't matter. This is earth-shattering to me. This whole experience. In the essay, it talks a little bit about, in the section on children, that there are some children who, I forgot exactly how he phrases it, but there's some children with this innate desire, this innate inclination, I believe is the term he uses, toward these fairy stories. It's no shocker that I believe both of us fit into that category, because stories for me have shaped my life greatly. And my likes of this essay, I think, is the summation of all British thought around this subject, especially about story. It's a summation that perfectly fits with my experience. And that's why I think it's earth-shattering, and that's why I love this essay, and that's what I really like about this essay, is British language. You probably have noticed it from John. Usually John doesn't use flowery language. I can kind of use flowery language every once in a while, but this is brought out flowery language in John. It's almost like it evokes, some inner consistency of reality or whatever. But that's exactly what this essay does. It's almost a fairy tale in of itself, where I ask the question, as in the child section of this essay, the question of every child around these fairy stories is this true? And I find myself, when I read through this once again, I'm saying, wow, is this true? Yeah. I mean, it makes complete experiential and rational sense to me. I know that really doesn't, that's like super broad strokes, but yeah, it's just all those things are just amazing.
No, that's really, really good. I don't think I realized that. But you're totally right. Because yeah, I asked the same thing. I don't realize I'm asking that question. But even reading through this, I'm like, this has to be real. Like you said, it just makes total sense, and it all fits together, and it's just beautiful. Love it.
I have to say, there's few things that make me tear up, especially scholarly works. Usually they're cold, hard. Like you said, there's a lot of good flavor in here. The epilogue is one of those parts that honestly gets me every single time. So this is probably a much different experience for the viewers. Like, what is happening to John and Nathan? Just a bunch of sappy, just one of those water beds that's just weeping. Anyway, okay, let's get into dislikes. Let's totally diss Tolkien right now.
Okay, well, I want to start then with mine.
Ooh. He's got them signed, sealed, and delivered. That's not even the right reference for this, but it sounds like the right reference.
So on page 24, when arguing about fantasy, he says, in human art, fantasy is a thing best left to words, to true literature. In painting, for instance, the visible presentation of the fantastic image is technically too easy. The hand tends to outrun the mind, even to overthrow it. He then later says on the same page, drama is naturally hostile to fantasy. And so, with the concept of Shpielberg in mind, we are here to discuss narrative in film, in games, in every aspect of storytelling. And so here comes Tolkien.
What does he know?
Saying, nah, fantasy is best left for the written word. We can ignore acting. We can ignore lighting and presentation. We can ignore the pacing of a visually told story. Or maybe not ignore, but it's too easy to do. That the truest form, as it were, of fantasy is literature. And so I read that and I'm like, man, what does that mean for what we're doing, for what we're talking about? Nathan, do you agree with his comment there? Because there's a part of me that says, man, this is Tolkien. Who am I to say otherwise? I am unqualified to go up against him. And yet I read this and go, man, I love motion pictures, which over the years they started as an adaptation of a stage play. You take a stage play, you point a camera at it, and that was the original motion picture. Over the years, though, they have become truly a work of their own medium, with their own direction, their own pacing. Their use of lighting and sound is different than a stage play, as Tolkien would say, a drama. And so, in addition to that, as someone who also likes video games, who takes a lot of the elements of film and theater and combines them with the interaction of the audience to tell a story. And so Nathan, with these new forms of storytelling that Tolkien may have been only partially familiar with, at least the motion picture aspect, which was still in its infancy at the time that this was that this essay was written. Would you agree with his comments there about fantasy?
So I'm going to use Tolkien against Tolkien.
This is so much fun. I love this.
So we have to remember that he is arguing on behalf of fairy stories. So when he says the best form of fairy stories in fantasy is through the written word, right? Taking into consideration what he says later, let's just focus on the primary world and subcreation, or the secondary world, right?
Oh, you're going to have to break that down, because we have to assume that our listeners, as intelligent and handsome and wonderful as they are, may not have the time to read this.
All right. There is 4 concepts: the primary world and the secondary world. We have creation and subcreation. Those are 4 categories, right? The primary world is that which we live in right now. Me and John are dialoguing in the primary world. The secondary world is the written world or the created world. Now, the created world is based on those who are in creation. Subcreation is that which is written by creation. We can kind of equate it to Dungeons and Dragons. There's other worlds. You know what? Let's even take it more comparable with Tolkien. Subcreation would be the world of Middle-earth in Lord of the Rings. So his world, in Tolkien's eyes, is a world, but it's a subcreation. It is the secondary world. It is not the primary world. It is the secondary world. And so those are those 4 concepts that really interact well with each other, kind of as a couplet. So is written word the only and purest form of fairy story? I would use Tolkien against Tolkien by stating that a secondary world or subcreation is not limited to written word. It is, in Tolkien's very understanding, his belief system around this, it is an experience. It is for the reader and the writer, while in the story, true. So, if a story is able to do so, then it is a true subcreation. And if the story, as in the later accounts of this essay, which is, I think, around recovery, escape, consolation, he states that one of the primary and almost necessary facts of a fairy story is the eucatastrophe. And I think if a story demonstrates eucatastrophe, it is a true subcreation or secondary world. So as long as that factor exists, I believe it fits into the Tolkien category of a fairy story.
Well, later on in that same argument about fantasy, he mentions that the moment you take subcreation, the world of fairy, as he puts it in literature, and you act it or you represent it, it is no longer part of subcreation. It is now a part of primary creation because it has been moved and adapted to a lesser degree into our world, into the world that we experience. And he uses the examples of if you were to turn a mouse into a giant in subcreation, that's fairly easy to do, as we can just say that it occurred,
right,
and believe that it did and experience it together in that state. But to depict a mouse transforming into a giant, even if done correctly, it is either a, how did he put it, a horrible thing to witness, or a cheapening of the magic that is present in subcreation.
Yes, but we have to understand, if we divide our capacity to engage with literary work, or let's say films or games, if we divide our capacity to engage that world on the basis of the means, then I don't think Tolkien's argument holds. If it is on the basis of the means that we receive Faerie, the land of Faerie, then we are no longer engaging in subcreation as Tolkien defines it, and as I previously explained how something is subcreation.
Well, that's part of his argument, that by transitioning from subcreation to primary creation through drama or painting, or in our case, video games or film, it is no longer subcreation at all.
Well, he's saying it's two. So this is very interesting. We're getting into semantics of Tolkien. So in painting, for instance, this is the direct quote, the visible representation of the fantastic image is technically too easy. So that's a degree. Could we say, hypothetically speaking, that a literary work is too close to the fantasy, therefore invalidating it? So that's what I'm saying. If it is a matter of degree on the basis of the means in which Faerie exists, then it ceases to have, I think, relevance. It has to be do you get what I'm saying?
But this goes back to my initial question, that Tolkien argues that literature is the highest form. And so there is a degree there in his argument. And so really my question is, what does this mean for the film, for the motion picture? What does this mean for the video game? Is something being left on the table when it is not as close as it can be to subcreation?
Tolkien never wanted his works to become a film. In fact, he despised technology. He was very much a Luddite, and probably for this principle. I would say, though, if he realized the capacity in which films and video games have currently to administer that eucatastrophe, I think he would maybe rethink his position and stance on the so-called purity of literature. Because we think Socrates didn't even like literature. He didn't want to write anything down. If Socrates is to that degree, imagine if we had Socrates versus Tolkien, well, you think literature, I don't write anything down. I just talk about things, I'm an orator, right? Okay, like we can become purist, but again, it's a matter of degree. And I think as long as we consider it a matter of degree, but rather than a matter of substance, that it is a quality, not a degree, it is a quality of story, then we get, which I think, again, Tolkien argues, and I would agree with you at this point, it does not necessarily logically coexist with one another.
That's an interesting point, based on the idea of degree, that a motion picture then can have a better substance, a better revelation of eucatastrophe, which, for those listening, if you don't know what that word means, we will get to it by the end of this episode.
You'll just have important. To be absolutely in the dark for like 30 or 40 minutes.
It's fine. You can do it. We believe in you. But if a motion picture can successfully deliver on eucatastrophe, then it actually would outshine some of the literature of fantasy that he himself brings up, and when he says that they are terrible and worthless. I don't remember the particular stories, but I think a few of them were written by Lang. Anyway, I just thought it was an interesting...
That is an
interesting point.
Very interesting. You know what? In order to be of one mind in Christ, I will say that is my negative as well. It is not completely logically coherent. his argumentation. But I think the emotion behind it is the logic. Again, that's a benefit for me. But I would say the same thing as you. This is my downside. This is my dislikes. In particular, this case, I do not agree completely with Tolkien. Which sounds wrong to say.
Oh, but that's what I knew that this would be an interesting episode, because I knew that there would be little things that Tolkien says that were like, whereas the rest of what he says were like, yes, more please.
So I think what gets bogged down is origins. This section, origins, is very scattered. And I think, obviously, the the concept Tolkien is trying to lay out is so broad, and he's trying to connect it to, as we've been pointing to, the last section, the epilogue. He does that really well in the last section heading of the essay. But I think in origins, in particular, it's too spread out. He tries to dabble, I think, too much with different senses of definitions, if that makes sense. So he begins with like, okay, in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made, fairy begins, man becomes a sub-creator. So he's setting out these massive principles, but we're not grabbing a hold of a lot, right? Before that, in page 10, we have philology has been dethroned from a high place it once had in this court of inquiry. Max Muller's view of mythology, disease language. So you really, I mean, as bare bones, as laid back as he tries to attempt this originally in the first page, he starts going into a wealth of knowledge that he has. And you as a reader have to just kind of go with it. So as a read, I would say origins in particular, but also just in general, it can be really difficult to understand and break apart what he's talking about when he's using all these references that he's accumulated over the years. That's probably the other smaller dislikes that I have.
You had mentioned his dislike of technology, and I know he goes into that a little bit. But he particularly mentions the idea that people would rather live in a world of technology than in a world of nature and simplicity. And at other times in this essay, he's mentioned other planets, and that oftentimes people, or he thinks that people imagine themselves like exploring and colonizing other planets in space with just the same amount of drudgery that is present in modern day, at least in his case, modern day England. And so this is partially one of my dislikes, because I really enjoy the use of technology in literature. Its use, its function, its misuse due to man's fallen nature. I think in the future we'll actually be covering a game or two that approaches some of these concepts. Not just a game, but movies as well. I can definitely promise that we will be tackling Blade Runner at some point in the future. And technology is core to that film. And I think that through technology, we're actually able to have more discussions about the nature of man than we would otherwise. Or at least to discuss them in a different light. So to have Tolkien poo-pooing technology, for some reason, he doesn't go into his own opinions enough on it as to why he has the opinion, just that his opinions are definitely negative. I would genuinely be curious as to know why. And we can say, sure, as Genesis depicts it, in the garden, there was no technology. It was very, very simple. And so if that is the purpose and the goal of man, is to be completely in communion with nature and with each other and with God, without technology present at all, then okay, I can understand some of Tolkien's reasoning for the dislike of it.
Yes, I would say that assumes technology is new. So it is the new that is truly technology.
Well, in the way that he argues it here, when he quotes Chesterton
Right.
and
Well,
talks
even in
about
the
the
garden.
electric street lamps.
So if we bridge that and we say, okay, Genesis doesn't have any technology. Well, hold on, wait a second. What was the first action that God had Adam do?
Name the animals?
Yes, but what is man doing? What is his usage in order to name the animal?
Language.
Guess what? Technology. I would argue language.
And you're going to need to.
Yeah. Language is a form of technology. The reason being, we even see this compared to the language of programming. In order for computers to operate, in order for street lamps to operate, there needs to be a logic behind it, right? There needs to be a calculated logic behind it. So for street lamps, back then, way far back, they would have a man go around and light the wicks. If it was gas powered, they would go around and light the gas from the lamps.
Uh-huh.
We can call that technology, right? Behind all of that is communication. And communication is inherent within all forms of technology. And I think Tolkien himself would recognize that, well, he distinguishes art from, well, no, because it's a very Chestertonian line of thought, that man is the only person who can recognize the difference between things, in the sense that he can recognize that not only is the grass green, but what is green. And that is completely different than any other animal. And that in it of itself is technology. What do you think?
So I can agree that we can define language as technology, certainly. I'm just not convinced that that is Tolkien's use. So I'll point out, he quotes Chesterton here. Just before that, he says, out comes the big stick, or the argument regarding electric lamps, that electric lamps have come to stay, they say. Long ago, Chesterton truly remarked that as soon as he heard that anything had come to stay, he knew that it would very soon be replaced. Indeed, regarded as pitiably obsolete and shabby. And so I think his concept of technology is just, okay, we have a horse, and we can jump on the horse, and we can ride to the next town faster than if we were to walk or to run. And now we can attach a carriage to the horse, and we can go from one place to another a bit faster. And then the electric motor is invented, and now we can build a vehicle, a car, that without a horse can travel from one place to another. And Tolkien seems to be saying that, I'll use the analogy of the car here, when the street lamp was created, it was not as bright as the lamp that used gas or a wick of some kind.
Metaphorically speaking, I don't think he's literally saying that electric lamps are dimmer than gas power light.
I'm pretty sure that when the technology first came out, they were worse. Everyone adopted them because they were new. My point is, cars, in likewise, when they first came out, were not as good as horses. You had a horse, a well-trained one, with a really good carriage and a good driver, you could outperform a car any day. But cars improved. And so I think that, and maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but I believe that Tolkien's dislike of technology was because in the, 20s and the 30s, the technology at the time was fairly new. With the Industrial Revolution that came about, a lot of that stuff was very, very new. And while people were right that it had come to stay, it wasn't all good technology. It has improved over the years, especially today. We have computers in the palm of our hands, or even on our wrists. Technology's come quite a long way. Perhaps quite a long way further than Tolkien had any idea that it could.
Yes.
Well, my whole dislike here is just that he seems to be poo-pooing technology just because at the point that it was at, it wasn't really a replacement for what had come before.
I agree. I think maybe I was approaching it from a different angle, disagreeing with his terms. The idea that he already had technology. It's kind of like the Amish dilemma, I'll use a buggy, but I won't use a car. Well, guess what? Buggies are still in the world. They were made when sinners were around, like newsflash. Maybe I'm not blaming Tolkien, but the idea that he disliked technology because it wasn't his technology is another logical fallacy. But I don't know if that's what he's saying. That's why I'm saying maybe it is more metaphorically speaking that in progress, we arrive at things because we have the latest technology. That I think he's butting up against that rather than the technology itself.
Sure. And that's totally fair. To think that we are somehow, yes, morally better off today, or that our civilization is somehow higher in worth, not necessarily in monetary value directly, but that the civilizations of previous ages should not even be considered when we talk about us today, then yeah, I completely agree with Tolkien in that regard. Just because something is old, that does not mean that it is obsolete. Those are my dislikes.
So,
those are the big ones.
Yes. I'll bridge off of what I said of the child. You kind of have to know the references that he's talking about. And that bogged me down a little bit. In that similar vein, I would say British intellectuals in this time period, and especially, I think Tolkien got this from Chesterton. Chesterton is kind of considered the man of paradox, and he loves paradox. He doesn't really care if his statements are paradoxical, but that they're rational in the grand scheme of things. And I like that. It kind of butts up against the Western philosophical grounding that the Greeks and Roman philosophers gave us, right? This is a totally different kind of thinking. It's almost Eastern, except with that backing of know that there is accessible truths. In that same vein, it can be difficult to see where is Tolkien making an assertive claim, a capital T truth, and where is he making filigree patterns with logic, in which it's not necessarily the main thing, but it points to the main thing. And so it's challenging, especially for readers, who are not in the 1940s and grew up in Britain and read British intellectuals, plus the massive libraries that they have in Cambridge and Oxford and St. Andrews, etc., for our whole lives. Kind of challenging on on our behalf. What do you think is the main argument, which might lead us into our fourth conversational topic? What do you think is the main argument that Tolkien is laying across with fairy and fairy tales?
Part of his argument of writing this essay at all, not only is asking the question of what is a fairy story and what is its purpose, but in his world, and I think in our world today, separated only by almost 100 years, is the idea that fairy stories are children's things, that they are intended for children, that they are written for children, and for an adult to read them and to focus on them is something that's almost out of place, that the adult is acting childish if they read these things. And Tolkien approaches that and argues against that. He says on page 20 that at least it will be plain that, in my opinion, fairy stories should not be specially associated with children. They are associated with them naturally because children are human, and fairy stories are a natural human taste, though not necessarily a universal one. Accidentally, because fairy stories are a large part of the literary lumber that in latter-day Europe has been stuffed away in attics. Unnaturally, because of erroneous sentiment about children, a sentiment that seems to increase with the decline in children.
Oof.
Because he argues in other places that fairy stories belong to children in as much as an old cabinet, an old armoire, an old anything is given to children for the playroom or for the nursery. That just because something is well crafted and is found in a nursery does not mean that it was primarily made for children's enjoyment.
Yeah.
And he argues that oftentimes if you were to give something that truly is made for an adult, such as a microscope, to a child, then it will be destroyed irreparably, because a child is not really intended for the full use of a microscope. And that because of that, oftentimes what are given to children as children's things are actually meant for humanity as a whole to learn and to grow from. And he then argues that, unfortunately, many fairy stories are actually stripped of a lot of their weight and dumbed down for children, and actually end up doing children a disservice. Because, as he puts it, oftentimes adults present things to children the way adults think children should receive them, and perhaps not as the child should actually naturally receive them. Because one of his arguments is, though it may be better for them to read some things, especially fairy stories, that are beyond their measure rather than short of it, their books, like their clothes, should allow for growth. And their books, at any rate, should encourage it. I love that argument so much. And honestly, this is something that I've felt for quite a long time, and this is the first time I've seen someone put it so eloquently, that so often we give children children's programs. And what that means in a modern context is programs devoid of any depth whatsoever. I think on our last episode, Nathan, you had brought up Bluey briefly, that Bluey is lacking depth. And funnily enough, I've actually heard a writer discuss that he was watching Bluey with his kids, and he found it to be far more deep than much of children's media, because it discussed concepts of death in some episodes, and the idea of loss and how we deal with that. But then here, Tolkien is pointing out something, like I said, that I've felt for a while, that why are we giving children something that is so anemic in its meaning, when for most of history, children have grown up either with nothing or with the Bible. And in recent years, with things as deep as The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, or Tolkien's own Lord of the Rings, as heavy as it is, I know many children who grew up reading it. And these are not shallow stories, but are stories that contain more depth than most adults are capable of grasping. And so his comment that books, like children's clothing, should allow for growth and should encourage the growth is amazing. I mean, imagine if we give our children stuff that is actually deep, that when they are young, they take it in and they enjoy it, and when they are old, they go back to it out of nostalgia and find this treasure trove of knowledge and wisdom that was there all along.
C.S. Lewis says that, actually, in the foreword of, I think, the first Narnia book, right? So this is the introduction of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is the first. Actually, funnily enough, Tolkien hated the Narnia Chronicles. He absolutely hated, which, and yet another thing that I disagree with Tolkien about, which, again, sounds wrong. But this is what it says. Introduction for Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, which is C.S. Lewis's first book on the Chronicles of Narnia. My dear Lucy, I wrote this story for you, but when I began, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it is printed and bound, you'll be older still. But someday, you'll be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can then take it down from the upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate grandfather, C.S. Lewis. Isn't that amazing?
That's good. Oh, how delightful.
Isn't this just wonderful? Oh, I could do this for hours.
And this is where I'm coming from when I say that those of us, and if any of you listeners write for all audiences or for children in particular, I really want to encourage you to write with that in mind, with that
yes.
same heart and mind that Lewis did, with the same heart and mind that Tolkien has here, that we leave the next generation something of substance. Substance enough not only for their generation, but for the generations that come after them.
Amen.
Oh, it's wonderful.
So, John, I think, we have been at this long enough where we can come to the much anticipated Eucatastrophe.
I'm partially saddened that we don't have the time, the headspace, or the focus to go through everything else, because as we've said so many times in this episode, this is a deep essay. And Lord willing, we'll be providing the link there that will remain in the description of this episode. I will highly recommend again that you listeners actually take the time to read this. And take your time. Don't rush this. This is worth chewing on. It does get a bit long in a few places, as Nathan and I have said, but it is well worth your time.
To end with author's intent, I'd like to quote Chesterton, the proto-evangelion of this line of thought, which is Chesterton. This is in his book, Orthodoxy. In short, I had always believed that the world involved magic. Now I thought that perhaps it involved a magician. And this point, a profound emotion always present and unconscious, that this world of ours has some purpose. And if there is a purpose, there is a person. I have always felt life first as a story. And if there's a story, there is a storyteller. So, with that, John, Evangelion and the Eucatastrophe.
Tolkien concludes this essay with the concept of eucatastrophe.
John, what's eucatastrophe?
What is eucatastrophe? That is a great question, and I want to say I have a direct quote here. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist, nor fugitive. In this fairy tale, or other-world setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is Evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief.
So it's a sudden turn of events for good instead of catastrophe. It's eucatastrophe. Catastrophe meaning the negative kind of chaos.
It's definitely the idea of the turning point for good. And honestly, I love how he puts there that there must be the possibility of a turning point for bad, a discatastrophe. And that is why I love the horror genre so much, is because there is always that sense of discatastrophe looming over the characters. Unfortunately, most horror films have no eucatastrophe. And that is what truly makes a story good and worthwhile, as we will see here. So Nathan, as I just read roughly what the eucatastrophe means as a word, why is it important in Tolkien's argument and in fairy stories and narrative and life as a whole?
So, this is where I get emotional.
As you should.
Because, oh lovely John and lovely viewers, it points to something. So, throughout this whole essay, Tolkien has been talking about the unique quality of a fairy story, that it explains more than almost any other genre. In a sense, it's the fullness of something. And the reason why the eucatastrophe in fairy stories are important is because Tolkien's major claim is that the eucatastrophe is not just a subcreation. The word eucatastrophe is a coined term by Tolkien. He invented it. It's actually not in our English language as like a normal word, a normative word that we use throughout the dictionaries. It's very specific to Tolkien. He's the one who started eucatastrophe, and people quote him on the basis of eucatastrophe. And insofar as it utilizes English, we can say that eucatastrophe as a word and as a concept is translated throughout all the languages. And this is what he means by eucatastrophe. In fairy stories, we get a glimpse. That's why the epilogue is hung up in my room. I would read it solemnly. If I could portray that on a podcast, I would do so. As the ground shakes before us, we could listen to what Tolkien says. But eucatastrophe is the idea that in a story, there will be a sudden turn of events for good. In what you just read, John, this doesn't negate evil. Evil is present. And when we think about and look back on the concepts of primary world and secondary world, or subcreation and creation, we know in our primary world, we have grief, unspeakable grief, to be experienced in this realm. And in fairy stories, we have different kinds of grief, because as Tolkien has pointed out, there necessitates a eucatastrophe in a fairy story, in a good fairy story. Why isn't it in our world? When we look in our world, when we look in the tale, as I read in Chesterton, there must be a storyteller to this grand story that we call primary creation, primary world. There must be a storyteller, and there must be a eucatastrophe. Well, who? If all stories reflect primary creation, what is our eucatastrophe? And again, I'm not doing any justice. I'm fumbling my words. It's very similar to enunciating the gospel. There is no other. Oh, wait, hold on. That's the eucatastrophe. The gospel. It says the birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends with joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There's no tale ever told by men that they would rather find true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merit. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. None of my oration skills can enunciate this greater. I mean, it's amazing. I'll leave the concept, which is all I've been able to portray so far, with the ending line of the epilogue. The Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind, but it is preeminently, infinitely, if our capacity were not finite, high and joyous. But this story is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. Amen.
Honestly, I love how he says that art has been verified. I was trying to think over all of this epilogue and what he's saying. And it's true. In the book of Genesis, chapter 3, verse 15, God demonstrates that this new problem that has entered the world, the problem of sin, will be taken care of through some mysterious man.
The seed.
Right. He relays this to the man and the woman while he's cursing the serpent, saying that I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman, between her offspring and yours. And he, this mysterious he, will crush your head, again referring to the serpent, and you will strike his heel. We're only 3 chapters into the Bible here. Right at the beginning of creation, man hasn't been around for very long, at least as far as we can tell. And if he has been around for a while, there's not too much he's accomplished. Mankind has not covered the earth yet. He has not produced generation upon generation of offspring. In fact, as far as we can understand, he hasn't even left the garden. And so at this point, there is now a problem introduced into creation. And God promises here, while cursing the serpent, that there is an outcome that will take care of things. And then a lot of time passes. A lot of people live and die. Civilizations rise and fall. Wars are fought. People are enslaved. People are freed. A lot happened in the world between then and when Jesus shows up on the scene. And so in between all of this time, art is being created. People are using their God-given secondary creation to come up with stories. And many of these stories have a eucatastrophe, a turning point, a point when something good happens that takes care of the problem, and then they live happily ever after. But this eucatastrophe had not been seen in the real world. It was something that was solely in secondary creation. It was something that had not been experienced in the grand history of man on a large scale. That the fall that happened in the garden, the corruption of mankind, had not been eucatastrophized, if we can butcher the word even further. And yet, when God fulfilled his promise to man there in the garden, that he would send someone to crush the serpent, this man Jesus finally arrives. And with him, eucatastrophe. And with eucatastrophe, the verification of art as something that is now whole. And for the first time, when Jesus shows up, is crucified, and rises again, sanctifying mankind, now art is also, in a sense, sanctified. Art is now fully recognized as legitimate, as not just something that is secondary, that man has made up on his own, but that God himself has acknowledged as, yes, stories are supposed to have a happy end, and the happy ending that I promised is coming about. And at the end of his epilogue, on the last page here, he concludes by saying, "All tales may come true, and yet, at the last, redeemed. They may be as like and unlike the forms that we give them as man. Finally redeemed, will be like and unlike the fallen we know." It's wonderful. And I've never been able to piece this together so well as the way that Tolkien says it here. That yes, the stories that we tell, the tales that have been weaved, the films and the narratives that we have enjoyed talking about so far on this podcast, and the many more that we will be addressing in the future, the games that we play that contain narrative, all of these things have been redeemed because Christ came and fulfilled what God had promised in the beginning. That mankind would receive a eucatastrophe, and that art would truly be completed, not through the work of man, but through the work of God. God himself coming as a man. And that is why we talk about this stuff. That's why we get excited when we hear a story, and we want to look at it closer, and look and see, what does this say about mankind? And what does this say about what God has promised and what God has been doing since the beginning of creation? The act of redeeming mankind through his son.
You know, in a world of postmodern relativism, I really do enjoy apologetics. I love apologetics. I love the evidence of the resurrection. It's amazing when you think about the historicity of our Christian faith. In a broader sense, our biblical faith. And what does Bible mean? It's a collection, biblios. A collection of what? Books. What are books? In our case, many of them are stories. And this grand narrative that you've just laid out for us, I think is one of the greatest apologetics that we have. You know, there's one thing to talk about the evidence of the resurrection, which must be talked about, must be proclaimed. That is the first thing in Acts 2, that's what they say. This Jesus who you crucified. And then Peter says, well, he is he did not stay dead, you know? He rose again. And that is an apologetic. He is claiming to be a witness. That is an apologetic. That is claiming that he has seen a person who has died, that it is historically and primarily true. in this, I think there is a deeper sense where we can experience an apologetic on a universal scale, like you said, once sanctified, once redeemed. For me, I have come to the, opinion that I am most convinced by stories. I would be called, if I could name myself, a storyist. The reason why I believe Scripture is not only because I believe them to be true, but I believe how Tolkien puts it. It is the closest. It has the taste of the inner consistency of reality. Now that's accumulative. Yes, I take the evidence of the resurrection. I take the evidence of Scripture, of the Old Covenant, that these things are historically true. And it's cumulative, but the reason why I believe it is because it is a story as I perceive my own life to be a story. And so, as a storyist, I will coin that term. As a storyist, I believe that the eucatastrophe is the greatest proof, the greatest apologetic toward the validity and veracity of Jesus being Lord. And so that's what I think this particular essay brings to the table. It gives me a language. It gives me an apologetic that's not only rational, but touches the very core of my being, which I think that's what we've been talking about, John.
Yeah, I know. I was in Haiti, and I was there to record people giving a recap of a ministry that's been going on in Haiti for over 15 years now. It became very clear to me that stories and storytelling is the core or part of the core of human existence. That is impossible for us to communicate with each other without telling story at some point. And so for the very concept of story not only to be woven into us as rational intellectual beings, but also to be woven into history as the purpose of why God did stuff. He did stuff so we could talk about it. He did stuff so we can share with each other. And to say, look at what God did, and look at the story that he has told. Isn't it great? Isn't it wonderful? Let's tell it again. Let's start at the beginning and let's go through again and glory and worship the Lord in all of these little things that he has done. But he has taken the time in the hustle and bustle of our lives and in the simplicity of the things that we do to make such bold movements that would inspire others to write grand tales. A lot of the stories that we have today, Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, to go back to older works, the works of Shakespeare, or the stories of King Arthur, to look at all of the grand stories that have been written, all of them in some way are based on what God has already done.
Primary creation, primary truth.
Exactly. What man has made, according to Tolkien in this essay, this idea of subcreation that man has pulled from primary creation means that God was the first one to come up with these things and to implement them as a story. And so I'm always encouraged by this, that now whenever I can go watch a movie or listen to someone share about their day, that in some way I am always hearing about the primary creation that God has done, whether the author intended it or not. The point of this essay is Christ. What more can be said than that?
Amen. You heard it here, ladies and gentlemen. Please read this essay. I'll do you one better. Please read your Bible. It's a pretty good story. And also, let us go out from this podcast encouraged, like you said, John, that everything is based in the Creator's world. And this Creator has not left us to the dicatastrophe that we are so presently experiencing. In this world, we will have suffering, but in the next, we will have Christ. And you know what he's called? The light of the world. Let us dwell in light today. Love you all. Brethren, keep the faith.